They brought him out at dawn, shackled but upright. The square in Smithfield wasn't just crowded, it breathed, tense, like a beast before feeding. Children stood on crates. Noblemen leaned from windows. Mothers held their sons tighter. The man in chains, caked in sweat and dirt, didn't cry out. He only looked ahead. A priest whispered last rites. Wallace said nothing. He had bitten off his own tongue the night before, to keep it from betraying him with screams. They stripped him bare, tied his limbs to horses, and waited. It wasn't just execution. It was a message carved in flesh. First, they dragged him through the filth of London's streets. Then came the knives, precise, methodical. His entrails were pulled out while he was still conscious. They burned what they took from him, there in front of his eyes. Finally, his heart was torn free, still beating. It was held aloft for the crowd. Someone cheered. Someone fainted. He was beheaded, his body quartered. The pieces were sent north to hang from bridges like warnings carved in bone. No gravestone marked where they left him. No psalm echoed his name. But in the Highlands, people whispered, not of his death, but of the words he never got to say. Because long before the blades came, Wallace had dared to stand. Not as a soldier, not as a king, but as a man who believed that freedom was worth being torn apart for. And for that, they destroyed him. But not his shadow, not the silence he left behind. Long before they called him traitor, before England sharpened its blades in his name, William Wallace was simply a boy. Born not in palaces or towers, but beneath the wide gray skies of Elderslie, where the wind carried the scent of ashwood and peat, and the rivers whispered stories older than the kings who ruled them. He was not the heir to thrones or titles, but the son of a minor landholder, Sir Malcolm Wallace, whose name was little known outside Renfrewshire, and whose lands, though respectable, could not shield a child from the tides of war that churned endlessly through Scotland. Wallace was born into a land already fraying. Scotland in the late 13th century was a kingdom teetering on the edge of dismemberment, not from foreign conquest alone, but from the corrosion of its own uncertain loyalties. The death of King Alexander III had left a void, a vacuum not just of power, but of hope. And into that vacuum rushed fear, ambition, and the long shadow of Edward Longshanks, whose eyes turned north with the hunger of empires. For most boys, childhood meant chores, prayers, and silence. For Wallace, it meant watching English troops patrol soil that wasn't theirs, hearing his elders speak in hushed tones of betrayal and resistance, and learning that borders weren't drawn with ink, but with blood. He learned to read before he learned to kill. Latin verses, church hymns, and the words of ancient saints poured into his ears from monks who saw promise in the boy's sharp mind and steady hands. But while the church offered him Latin, the land gave him Gaelic, the language of his people's sorrow. And it was in that rough, broken tongue that he heard the first stories of rebellion. Around fires and over graves, he listened as old men recited tales of resistance not as legends, but as obligations passed from father to son, not with pride, but with urgency. He did not yet wield a sword, but he began to understand what it meant to live as a conquered people. How a man could walk his own field and feel like a trespasser. How the law could wear the face of the enemy. No one marked the moment the boy began to harden. There were no proclamations, no rites of passage. It came quietly, in gestures small and cruel. The confiscation of livestock under foreign orders, the forced quartering of English soldiers in Scottish homes, the desecration of churches by hands that spoke a different tongue. Each act was a lesson. Each silence from Scotland's nobles, a betrayal. Wallace's father died when he was young. Some say in battle, others say in an ambush. The truth, like so much of his early life, is veiled in rumor, cloaked in centuries of romanticism and rage. What mattered was not how he died, but what his death left behind. A mother with sons she could not protect, and a boy who would grow into a man with no illusions about the mercy of those in power. The loss etched itself into his memory, not as a wound to be mourned, but as a purpose to be carried. They say he left home for safety, for study, perhaps even for love. What he found instead was a nation cracking beneath the weight of submission. Wherever he traveled, Dundee, Perth, Lanark, he saw the same faces, bowed heads, clenched fists, voices lowered in fear. The air was heavy with a kind of silence that could only mean waiting, for rescue, for revolt, or for ruin. He did not speak loudly, not yet. He listened. He watched. He learned not just how to swing a blade, but how to speak with clarity, how to convince men who had lost everything that not all hope was dead. He was not born a leader, but he began to carry himself like one. And in that slow, quiet awakening, a new kind of threat was born, not of armies or kings, but of an idea that could not be hanged or flayed. That one man's refusal to kneel could become a fire across a nation. There was no prophecy to mark him, no star, no vision, just a boy who learned too early that obedience did not bring safety, and silence did not bring peace. And once he understood that, he began to look at the world not as it was, but as it might be, if men dared to fight for it. He had no coat of arms that mattered, no royal backing, no seat at any council. But he had something rarer, the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose, and the conviction that even a nameless son from the Western Shires could force history to speak his name, even if only through the mouths of his executioners. There was a time when William Wallace still believed that justice, though bruised and bloodied, might be found somewhere within the architecture of kings, or buried in the dust-laden creases of forgotten laws, or even whispered by the lips of those priests who still dared to look English knights in the eyes and speak of mercy. That illusion did not die all at once. It eroded slowly, like rain shaping stone, not with thunderous collapse, but with persistent cruelty, repeated with the indifference of power that has forgotten the weight of its own violence. It began not with war drums or assassinations, but with the simple, savage spectacle of a hanging carried out in a village square. A man whose only crime had been refusing to surrender his grain to an English garrison already glutted with stolen food. Wallace did not know the man's name. He had come to town for trade, not vengeance, and stood among the onlookers who didn't speak, didn't cry out, didn't even look at each other. They only watched. That silence, thicker than any fog that rose from the nearby fields, wrapped itself around Wallace's throat more tightly than any noose could. And something within him began to shift, not as a rage, but as a wound that refused to scab over. The man swung for hours. His legs stopped kicking long before the guards grew bored. No priest was called. No family was allowed to take the body down. Instead, they left it there, twisting in the wind. An emblem of order imposed by force, of peace purchased with blood. It wasn't a warning. It was a branding. Wallace left that day without speaking to anyone, but his eyes no longer scanned the road ahead for English patrols. They searched instead for patterns, for signs that the arbitrary brutality he had just witnessed was not an accident, not the work of a rogue captain or a corrupted soldier, but part of something larger, colder, more deliberate. And he found them, not in proclamations or royal decrees, but in the quiet terror with which villagers referred to the collectors, in the way men removed their hats, not out of reverence, but out of instinctive self-preservation whenever an English banner passed by, in the notches carved into cottage door frames to mark the number of horses quartered there without consent. It was not the taxes or the conscription or the curfews that revealed the truth. It was the erosion of dignity, the normalization of humiliation, the way Scottish men walked like guests in their own land, and how even the children had learned to play quietly when soldiers passed. He came to understand that conquest was not only fought in fields, it was waged in bread lines, in whispered prayers, in the aching silence that followed every unpunished murder. Still, he held his anger, not because he lacked it, but because he feared what might happen if he allowed it to speak. He had seen others, young men with fire in their bellies and steel in their hands, try to strike back, only to vanish without a trace. Some returned in pieces. Some never returned at all. The English did not only kill bodies, they killed names. They erased fathers from ledgers, sons from family histories, wives from memory. To fight was to risk not only death, but oblivion. But silence did not save the innocent. It never had. The final unraveling came in a place no larger than a chapel, a narrow, dim-lit space where an English official accused a local farmer of sedition, of hoarding grain, of sheltering rebels, of thinking too freely. Wallace was there, again by chance. He had come with a friend, a merchant's son, to retrieve a cart axle. They arrived just as the man was being dragged inside by soldiers whose armor bore no heraldry, just the dull glint of authority enforced without signature. What followed was not a trial. It was a ritual humiliation. The questions were statements. The answers were moot. The punishment had been written long before the first word had been spoken. When the farmer begged, not for mercy, but for his wife to be left alone, Wallace saw something he would never forget. Not in the act itself, which was hidden behind the iron-studded door, but in the way the official smiled, tilted his head, and nodded once, slowly, as though cruelty required ceremony. Wallace did not intervene, not yet. He left that building with clenched fists and a stomach turning in on itself. And for the first time in his life, he understood that law, once bent to the will of fear, did not break. It calcified into something far more dangerous. That was the moment he stopped believing that resistance was rebellion. He began to see it instead as reclamation. In the weeks that followed, he wandered more than he rested, not aimlessly, but deliberately, seeking out places where rumors of abuse had taken root, speaking to people who had nothing to offer but truth scraped raw by despair. He heard stories of fields salted as punishment, of women taken and left ruined, of sons conscripted and never seen again. But more than the pain, he listened for something else. Something that, to his astonishment, had not died completely. The willingness to speak of freedom, however softly, however hopelessly. He did not tell anyone what he was planning, because he wasn't planning anything. Not yet. But he began to collect moments, names, faces. He remembered which captains were known for cruelty. He took note of which hamlets still whispered the names of old kings in their prayers. He learned where the forest grew thick enough to hide a man. He began to trace the shape of a different Scotland, not on any map, but in the defiance that still sparked behind tired eyes. And somewhere in the midst of it all, Wallace stopped being a witness and became something else entirely. Not yet a rebel, not yet a leader, but a man who no longer asked if he had the right to act, only how long he could wait before doing so. The first crack in the crown did not come from war or revolt or political betrayal. It came from one man watching another die for nothing and realizing that if nothing changed, more would follow. It came from a silence that was not peaceful, but enforced. It came from the realization that power had become its own justification, and that someone someday would have to break the cycle, not with parchment, but with steel. Wallace did not know then that history would remember him, but he knew that if he remained still, his children, if ever he had any, would be born into chains, and that he could not allow. There are moments in history not marked by grand coronations or battlefield trumpets, but by something far smaller. By the way a man breathes when he sees someone he loves being dragged away. By the sound of a single scream swallowed too quickly, or by the wet, metallic scent that clings to a courtyard long after the blood is dried. For William Wallace, the fire did not begin with a sword or a rebellion. It began with her. Her name was Marion Braidfeud, though many would come to forget it, replacing her with symbols and songs, turning her into a myth so polished it no longer resembled the woman she had been. But Wallace knew her not as a cause, not as a martyr, but as a person. Flesh and warmth, laughter in shadowed places, the soft defiance in her eyes when English soldiers passed too close, and the quiet steadiness of someone who refused to live small in a world that demanded obedience from the meek. They had no grand wedding, no royal witness, no armies in attendance, just the hush of the Scottish hills, the ache of uncertainty pressing down on every gesture, and a promise exchanged not with rings, but with presence. The kind of love forged not in comfort, but in the knowledge that time was borrowed and danger always just one step behind. Wallace married her not for politics nor property, but for something rarer in that age: belief. She believed in him, not as a warrior, not as a rebel, not even as a protector, but simply as a man who tried, who did not look away. But the world did not care for vows made in silence. One morning, under the weightless gray of a spring sky, the soldiers came, not in legions, not with drums, but with the same cold efficiency that had become their signature. They rode into Lanark like they owned it, because they believed they did. The local magistrate, an Englishman named William Heselrigg, had received word, some whispered accusation of Wallace's presence, of insubordination, of unpaid tribute, of defiance in the form of dignity. Whether it was true or merely convenient hardly mattered. In a world run by fear, the difference between suspicion and guilt was irrelevant. Wallace was not there when they arrived. Some say he had gone to the edge of town to meet a contact. Others say he had been warned too late. What is known is this: they did not come for him alone. When they found Marion, she did not plead. She did not beg. She stood between them and the door, and in doing so, she committed an unspoken crime. She reminded them that not all Scots bowed, and for that, they took her. Some accounts say she was held overnight, questioned, humiliated. Others claim it was quicker. What none dispute is the end. She was executed without trial, strangled in the public square as a warning, not to rebels, but to wives. Her body was left hanging long enough to sour the air, long enough for her neighbors to learn what happens when a woman dares to stand in the path of empire. Wallace returned too late. He did not scream. He did not collapse. He walked into the square, stood beneath her still swinging body, and stared. Not at the soldiers, not at the jeering onlookers, but at the gallows itself. And something within him, something that had been burning low since childhood, something fed by every injustice, every theft, every insult dressed as law, that something caught fire. He did not go home. He did not bury her. He found his sword, and for the first time, he used it not in training, not in defense, but in fury cold enough to kill without hesitation. That night, he returned to the magistrate's hall, not with an army, not with fanfare, but with purpose honed into silence. What he did inside those stone walls was not written down in detail, though echoes of it still live in the nightmares of those who heard the screams. William Hazelrig was not hanged. He was not beheaded. He was torn apart, his body shattered, his blood painted across the very floor where Marion had once walked. And when the town awoke the next morning, they found the magistrate's seat empty, his guards dead, and a symbol carved into the door, a cross, inverted and burned, not as blasphemy, but as a reckoning. That night did not start a war, but it started Wallace. He did not flee as many expected. He remained close, too close, wandering from village to village, not hiding but listening. And wherever he went, stories followed. Stories of a man who had defied the English and lived. Stories of a widowmaker turned ghost. Stories of vengeance not driven by chaos, but by an impossible grief made righteous. In Scotland, grief was familiar, but vengeance with discipline, that was new. And men began to gather. They did not come as soldiers. They came as butchers, farmers, blacksmiths. They came not for gold or glory, but because someone had finally done what they had dreamed of doing in the darkest hours of night. And in Wallace, they saw not a hero, but a mirror of everything they had lost, everything they had feared, and everything they still hoped to reclaim. What began as mourning became movement. And Wallace, once a boy who watched hangings in silence, became the man who would make the gallows shake. There is a moment in every rebellion when a name ceases to belong to the man who bears it and instead becomes a weapon, a rumor, a force greater than flesh. And for William Wallace, that moment came not when he raised his sword, nor even when he felled his first English magistrate, but when whispers of what he had done began to carry farther than the wind could trace, crossing fields, slipping between the cracks of castle walls, leaping from the lips of farmers in the north to the ears of men who sat in velvet-draped halls far to the south, men who did not bleed for Scotland, but who now feared it. What began as isolated defiance in Lanark quickly morphed into something the English crown had not anticipated. Not because of its scale, which was modest, or its brutality, which was expected, but because of the way it spread, not as strategy, but as belief. Wallace did not write manifestos. He did not send declarations to the court of Edward I, nor did he demand recognition from any Scottish noble house. And yet, as if summoned by pain made visible, men began to rally behind his shadow. not all at once, and not all with swords, but with bread, with shelter, with silence offered when patrols asked questions. He became, in the minds of many, not a rebel, but a reckoning long overdue. It was not rebellion that made the English nervous. They were familiar with uprisings, had crushed them in Wales, had smothered them in Ireland, had cut down their own lords when the throne required it. But what made Wallace dangerous was something far less tangible: his refusal to play by the roles expected of him. He did not beg for clemency. He did not seek alliances through marriage or coin. He appeared, struck, vanished, and left behind not just corpses, but a silence that questioned the very legitimacy of the rule that sent them. When word reached King Edward, Longshanks, as his enemies called him, that a low-born Scotsman with no title, no formal military training, and no noble blood had executed an English-appointed official and rallied men to his cause, the king did not fly into rage. He calculated. He understood, as few rulers of his time did, that authority was not maintained by armies alone, but by narrative. And in that moment, Wallace ceased to be a man and became a story, one that needed rewriting before it took deeper root. The royal decrees came swiftly, not in the form of open warfare, but through language. Wallace was labeled an outlaw, a murderer, a thief, a traitor to the peace imposed by the crown. His family lands, modest as they were confiscated. Anyone offering him aid faced execution. Captains were dispatched not just to kill him, but to erase him. He was not to be martyred. He was to be forgotten. But stories have a way of resisting silence. And the more Edward tried to crush the tale, the louder it echoed. In the southern lowlands, men began speaking of Wallace not as a criminal, but as a liberator. Ballads emerged, sung quietly in taverns where English ears were scarce. Women passed messages in loaves of bread. Blacksmiths sharpened not just horseshoes, but blades hidden beneath cloaks. And Wallace himself, no longer hiding, began to organize. Not because he saw himself as a general, but because others had already begun to act like soldiers in his name. He struck again and again. Garrisons fell. Supply routes vanished. English patrols began riding with double the usual numbers, yet still they disappeared into the mist. The attacks were precise, ruthless, and oddly principled. Wallace did not burn churches. He did not slaughter peasants. He spared messengers, took prisoners, and sent them back with warnings written in blood. But only in English. The Scots nobles, many of whom had long compromised with England for land or safety, watched with unease as the peasant's son did what their titles and treaties could not: ignite fear in the empire that claimed dominion over them. Some saw opportunity, others saw danger. All saw that the English crown now had a face to fear, and it wore no coronet. By the time Wallace led his first sizable force into open battle, he was already legend. Stirling Bridge would not be his coronation, but it would be his announcement, not to Scotland, but to the world, that resistance had learned how to speak with steel. The victory, unexpected and devastating, shattered the illusion that England's rule was inevitable. It sent a ripple through Europe. It forced Edward to pause campaigns abroad. It shifted the very geometry of power. But with victory came visibility. The English no longer searched for a fugitive. They hunted a symbol. And Edward, who had crushed rebellions with cold, surgical efficiency before, understood that this one, would require something different. Wallace was not merely to be destroyed, he had to be unmade. His character would be dismantled in pamphlets. His cause would be tied to chaos and treason. And when the time came, his death would not be quick, because the worst threat to any crown is not an army, it is an idea. Wallace had become that idea. He had not claimed a throne, he had not declared himself king, but he had shown an entire people that power did not require permission. And so, the crown marked him. Not with chains, not yet, but with the kind of attention that makes execution a certainty and survival a question not of skill, but of time. Every rebellion begins in clarity, but ends in smoke. And for William Wallace, the smoke did not rise from the ruins of English castles or the ashes of royal proclamations burned in secret. No, it rose from within, from the slow curling embers of trust undone, of alliances fractured not by swords, but by silence, of promises made by men whose loyalty extended only as far as their convenience could carry it. Betrayal is rarely loud. It is the sound of doors closing softly behind you, of gazes that look away too quickly, of hands that once offered bread, now handing over maps and names to the enemy. By the winter of 1304, Wallace was no longer a ghost. He was a hunted man whose victories had turned into echoes, and whose support had begun to thin like frost under English breath. Stirling Bridge had made him a hero. Falkirk had made him mortal. The nobles who once called him brother now whispered of his recklessness, his refusal to bow, his dangerous insistence that freedom should not be negotiated, but taken, even if it meant dragging an entire nation through blood and fire. They had made peace. He had not. While Robert the Bruce and John Comyn played their pieces on the chessboard of Scottish nobility, Wallace remained outside the game entirely. Not because he lacked the wit to engage in politics, but because he had seen too clearly what politics demanded. The compromise of conviction, the burial of memory, the dressing of wounds in silk so they might look presentable in court. Wallace did not wear silk. He wore scars, and scars made people uncomfortable. He refused every offer of clemency. He declined every invitation to parley. He did not beg for titles, for protection, for gold. Instead, he returned to the hills, to the glens, where he had once hidden with fewer men and more certainty. And yet, even there, the air had changed. The villagers who once fed him now hesitated. The fires that once welcomed him now flickered with caution. The songs sung in his name had grown softer, as if invoking him too loudly might summon the wrath of those who hunted him. And they did hunt him. Edward's men did not search blindly. They were guided, step, by whispers bought with coin, by threats made in shadowed corners, by lords who smiled with one hand extended to London and the other carefully folded behind their backs. It was not an army that betrayed Wallace. It was a name. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight, a man of stature, a man who once rode under the same banner Wallace had carried into fire. History does not agree on the price. Some say gold, some say lands, some say it was fear. But what is clear is that it was he who delivered the final blow without lifting a sword. Wallace had taken shelter near Glasgow, perhaps to recover, perhaps to regroup. He was not hiding in cowardice, but in weariness. The kind that seeps into bone after years of watching men bleed for a cause too fragile to survive the weight of compromise. He slept in the shadows of stone walls that had once heard him laugh. And while he slept, The doors opened. They did not break them down. They walked in quietly. They bound him in chains. No army to greet him. No herald to announce the capture of Scotland's most wanted man. Just the cold touch of iron, the smothering dark of a hood drawn over his head, and the quiet shuffle of feet carrying him not toward justice, but toward a performance already written. They took him to London. It was not a trial he faced. It was a ritual. He was paraded through streets not in triumph, but as a warning. Dressed not as a warrior, but as a criminal, a symbol stripped of armor, forced to wear the accusations that had replaced his name. Murderer, traitor, savage. The crowds did not cheer. They stared. Some threw stones, others looked away. And in the quiet, beneath the jeers and the whip cracks, Wallace walked with his head unbowed, not because he did not feel fear, but because he understood that fear, unlike dignity, could be taken by force. He was not allowed to speak. When the court read his charges, they did not pause for rebuttal. When they sentenced him, they did not look him in the eye. To do so might have reminded them that beneath the name, beneath the legend, beneath the rebellion, there was a man. And men, unlike myths, bleed only once. They would ensure he bled slowly. The sentence was death, not by sword or gallows, but by degradation, by a procession of horrors designed not merely to kill, but to unmake, to reduce what had once been defiance into spectacle. It was not enough that Wallace die. He had to die as a lesson. To others, to Scotland, to himself. But before that, there was the cell. Cold, narrow, silent, no fire, no voice, no priest, only the sound of chains against stone, and waiting. They did not bring him to the gallows in haste. The path was long, deliberate, slow, cruel in its choreography. From the Tower to the fields of Smithfield, William Wallace was not escorted as a prisoner, but displayed as a trophy of imperial correction. Pulled behind horses in a cart designed not for mercy, but for humiliation. Its wooden wheels moaning over every uneven stone, as if the city itself were protesting the weight it bore. The crowd had gathered not as mourners, nor even as witnesses, but as participants in a ritual older than justice. The kind of punishment meant not to enact law, but to etch fear into the very soul of a people. Mothers held their sons closer. Vendors whispered prayers between sales. Children climbed crates for a better view, not yet old enough to understand what it means to watch a man die in pieces. The air was thick with the kind of anticipation reserved not for endings, but for reckonings. And at the center of it all, silent, bloodied, half-starved, stood the man who once refused to kneel. They had stripped him of his name, but not his bearing. His garments, torn and stained, hung loosely from his frame, his wrists rubbed raw beneath the iron. Yet there remained in his eyes a clarity that unsettled those who expected madness. He had not broken in the cell. He had not wept when they read his sentence. He had not begged for reprieve. And now, as the executioner prepared his tools, Wallace did not tremble. He looked ahead. The sentence, read aloud before the gathered mass, was not simply death. It was the dismantling of a symbol through flesh. To be hanged, but not until death. To be opened, but not completely. To be displayed, but never mourned. It was not an execution, it was a message. They began by raising him from the ground, not to lift him toward any heaven, but to remind those watching that power could suspend a man between life and death and keep him there as long as it pleased. The rope bit into his throat, not with the finality of strangulation, but with the hesitation of cruelty engineered for spectatorship. His feet kicked, his lungs clawed for air, his eyes bulged, not in terror, but in the mechanical reflex of a body fighting a death it was not yet allowed to have. Before darkness could take him, they cut him down. He fell not as a man, but as a weight, collapsing onto wood darkened by the stains of predecessors whose names had not endured. Then came the knives. But history does not need the grotesque in detail to communicate horror. It needs only the silence that follows the scream, the way the crowd falls still when they realize what they are watching is not punishment, but theater, not justice, but spectacle. Wallace did not plead, not when the blades carved him open, not when the heat of iron singed what should never have seen daylight. His pain, though unimaginable, remained unspoken. Whether by force or by will, he gave them no satisfaction. When they removed the pieces they claimed made him a man, they burned them before his fading eyes. Still, he did not yield. His heart, they say, was torn out last, still beating, still whole, still his. It was raised aloft like a relic, proof that kings could reach inside the chest of a rebel and extract what made him dangerous. But the truth was far more damning. Though they could destroy the body, they could not touch the resolve that had lived in it. When the axe finally came down, it was almost an afterthought. The severed head, pale and bloodless, would later be boiled and placed upon a spike atop London Bridge. His limbs, quartered and dispersed to the corners of the kingdom, would hang from gates in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, reminders not of a man, but of a warning. There was no gravestone, no procession, no final rites, only the wind, carrying the smell of ash and iron, brushing past the onlookers like a question no one dared answer. They did not ring bells. They did not record his last words. They recorded his silence. And yet, somewhere beyond the reach of English law and the ink of royal scribes, the whisper began again. Not in cities, but in the heather-covered hills. Not in courts, but in hearth-warmed rooms where mothers taught their children to speak his name in the same breath as freedom. Not because he won, but because, even when faced with the most methodical disassembly of self, William Wallace had refused to make them comfortable with his dying. He gave them no screams, no apologies, no surrender, only the image of a man torn apart, yet somehow still whole. They said nothing. Not the court that condemned him, not the scribes who kept records of justice meted out in royal name, not the bishops who had once quoted scripture to justify conquest, nor the nobles who had once toasted his victories before, withdrawing their loyalty like merchants pulling back a loan. The silence was not accidental. It was calculated, rehearsed, imposed. They did not want William Wallace to be remembered. They wanted him to be erased, not in the sense of denial, but in the more insidious art of reduction, of folding his memory into the margins of history until the very fact of his existence became questionable. A rumor too dangerous to name and too resilient to fully extinguish. In the days that followed his execution, there were no formal declarations from the throne. No public statements issued to the kingdom. No edicts read from pulpits across the shires. His name did not appear in the royal accounts of that month, nor in the foreign correspondence from the court of Edward I. Instead, there was only omission. A strategic absence that spoke louder than any condemnation could. They left no room for mourning, because mourning is a kind of memory, and memory, when attached to pain, becomes resistance. The English crown had learned from centuries of rebellion that the most dangerous men were not those who fought, but those who left behind unfinished sentences, unanswered questions, and unburied truths. Wallace, they decided, would not be enshrined in martyrdom. He would be dismantled into myth, stripped of complexity, reduced to caricature. To speak of him would be to risk inviting his return, not in body, but in belief. And so, they wrote him as a criminal. In the fragments of English chronicles that mentioned his death, he was framed as a brigand, a killer, a man driven not by principle but by bloodlust. Someone whose execution was not a tragedy, but a necessity. He was not a leader. He was a disruption. He was not a patriot. He was a murderer. And most critically, he was not one of them. He was other. Dangerous, deviant, disposable. They sent his limbs to the corners of the kingdom, not just to frighten the rebellious, but to fragment his legacy, so that no place could claim him whole, so that no shrine could be built, so that no body could be found to bury. A man without a grave, they believed, would become a man without a future. But what they failed to understand, what power so often misunderstands, is that silence is porous, that it leaks, that even when mouths are forced shut, the spaces between words continue to hum with meaning. The people who had sheltered him did not forget. The villagers who had seen him pass through in the night. The blacksmiths who had hidden weapons for him beneath false floors. The widows who had fed his men from what little grain they had. All of them remembered, and in the remembering, kept him alive. They did not need parchment. They needed only memory. And memory in Scotland is a thing that sinks deep. The English courts believed that history belonged to those who wrote it. But Wallace had never relied on scribes to define him. He had lived among the illiterate, the dispossessed, the nameless. And when the scribes refused to speak of him, the songs did. Low songs, sung in the dusk, passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Songs that told not of battles, but of courage whispered before dawn. Not of thrones lost, but of dignity preserved. Not of what he failed to achieve, but of how he refused to yield. The silence imposed from the top could not penetrate the roots. Still, the erasure persisted in official places. Wallace's family was denied honors. His lands remained seized. His name did not reappear in noble correspondence. For years, those who spoke of him in public did so cautiously, their voices measured, their words veiled in metaphor. To speak of Wallace was to challenge a truth that had been manufactured by force. In England, the crown had moved on. Edward was old, brittle, and increasingly obsessed with the complete submission of Scotland, had begun to focus his gaze on other figures, other threats. Wallace was no longer a man to be hunted. He had become a ghost, and the English believed they had exorcised him. But ghosts do not vanish. They wait, and in waiting, they gather strength. In the very act of trying to erase Wallace, the crown created something far more dangerous than a man. They created a silence filled with questions. Why had this one man resisted when others had knelt? What had he seen that made death preferable to surrender? And why, despite all efforts, did his name still linger? Spoken softly, sung gently, etched not on marble, but on memory? Even in places where his name could not be spoken aloud, his story re-emerged in gestures, in defiance unclaimed, in refusals left unexplained. And in time, the silence meant to bury him became the soil from which legend grew. They had tried to end him with fire and iron, but what remained was smoke. And from that smoke, shapes began to form, long after the blood dried on the stones of Smithfield, long after the limbs once called his were reduced to ash or bone or forgotten scaffolding for moss and bird droppings, long after kings changed, borders shifted, and the names of his captors were etched into forgotten pages of legal proceedings buried beneath the weight of better stories. His voice, or at least the shadow of it, refused to leave the air. It lingered, not in proclamations or speeches, but in the quiet tremor that passed between generations whenever injustice returned wearing a different face. They had silenced his body, but not the sound of his refusal. The echo began faintly, not with trumpets or proclamations, but in places where the law did not reach, around hearths where old women told stories with lowered voices, and eyes that flickered toward windows, in shepherds' huts nestled between ridges where rebels had once hidden beneath stars, in churches where prayers were whispered in Gaelic rather than Latin, invoking not saints but names the church had chosen not to canonize. Wallace was not beatified, but he was remembered. And sometimes, that is more dangerous. What began as memory became myth, and what was myth soon grew roots in culture. He was no longer just the man who was quartered by a crown, desperate to prove its own invincibility. He became the one who had stood while others knelt, who had chosen fire over comfort, who had been offered silence and answered with defiance. And though time sanded the details into smooth legend, though victories became blurred and losses erased by longing, the soul of the man survived the mutilation of history. In paintings, he appeared not as he likely was, a weathered warrior, gaunt from years of hiding and hunger, but as a giant, sword raised against storm-darkened skies, cloaked in tartan like thunder made flesh. In ballads, his voice could rally legions with a single cry, his heart beat louder than drums. His death caused the sun to retreat in shame. None of this was true, but all of it was necessary, because what Wallace offered was not merely a story, but a mirror. A way for a people stripped of sovereignty to look at their own reflection and find there not only tragedy, but dignity. Writers found him, centuries later, in the half-light of rebellion retold. Poets dipped their pens into the wound and pulled forth words wrapped in ash and pride. Blind Harry, in the 15th century, composed the Wallace, a sweeping epic that may have cared more for inspiration than documentation, but which ensured that the man the crown tried to erase would forever be inked into the Scottish soul. The verses, passed from voice to voice, rekindled what had nearly been lost. For those who read it, Wallace ceased to be a ghost. He became a banner. And even as Scotland moved forward, through war, through union, through industrial fog and modern disillusionment, his figure remained at the edge of every reckoning. Every time the question of freedom was raised, every moment when the old struggle between crown and conscience reappeared beneath different masks, he stood there, not always named, not always clearly drawn, but present in the weight of the silence that followed each betrayal of justice. In monuments, they finally gave him what kings denied, form, height, permanence. The Wallace Monument, rising from the Abbey Craig like a spear thrust toward history itself, towers above the landscape not to dominate it, but to bear witness. Visitors climb its narrow stairwells, breath growing thin as they ascend toward a view that stretches across fields where he once bled. And in that wind-whipped quiet, some swear they can feel the hum of a presence that never truly left. But it was not only Scotland that felt the echo. Elsewhere, among other oppressed peoples, the story of Wallace found resonance. His tale was translated into languages spoken in lands where the weight of empire still pressed down on those too poor to resist openly. His defiance became a parable, his fate a caution, his silence a kind of code. In places where names were banned and flags burned, Wallace became shorthand for what it meant to die whole. And in time, even those who once vilified him began to reshape the narrative, not out of repentance, but out of necessity. The English textbooks softened their tones. The monarchs who followed Edward I no longer spoke of Wallace as a threat, but as a figure of note, perhaps misguided, perhaps extreme, but undeniably brave. The same system that once dismembered him now absorbed him, rebranding the rebel as a romantic, a relic, a safely distant hero whose rage had long since cooled. But the people remembered differently. To them, Wallace was never just a chapter. He was a question. What would you do if it were your fields taken, your language forbidden, your love hanged for standing still? Would you kneel, or would you burn? And though generations passed, though politics shifted and borders blurred, that question never did. He had no children to carry his name. But he had a country, and that country, however fractured, however weary, carried something far more enduring than blood. It carried memory, not perfect, not factual, but alive. History often chooses the survivors. It crowns those who endure, who outlive the chaos, who sign treaties and sit at tables and wear medals for decisions made when the fire had already gone out. But sometimes, rarely, history remembers the ones who died too early, too violently, too completely, because something in the way they vanished left a scar too deep to heal. And William Wallace was one such scar. He did not build an empire. He did not sit on a throne. He did not leave behind heirs, cities, or volumes of political thought. But he left something more unruly. He left the idea that a man without power, without title, without an army, could still shake the foundations of a world built to silence him. And that if he stood long enough, defiantly enough, honestly enough, that world would be forced to either kill him or change. They chose to kill him. And yet, in the quiet that followed, they could not kill what he had exposed. That the true danger to any empire is not rebellion, but belief. Especially when it resides in someone who no longer fears the consequence of having it. As I sit with his story, bloodied, brutal, and buried under centuries of distortion, I find myself returning to one image. Not the execution, not the sword, not even the monument that now bears his name, but the silence he carried in those final moments. A silence not of surrender, but of understanding. He knew, in those last minutes, that they could take everything but one thing: the knowledge that he had not betrayed what he believed to be right. There's something terrifyingly beautiful about that, and something terribly lonely. Because belief like that rarely ends in applause. It ends in isolation, in shackles, in pain so immense it must be endured without sound. Most of us, myself included, want to think we'd be brave enough to stand. But we don't know what we'd do, not really. We don't know what we would say if they came for us, not with blades, but with doubt, with pressure, with the slow erosion of principle in favor of comfort. We hope we'd choose integrity, but then again, Wallace didn't have the luxury of hoping. He had to decide, and once he did, he never stepped back. Not once. Even when the cost was everything. That's why they hated him, and that's why, in the end, they couldn't erase him. Because the man was torn apart, but the idea was left whole. And so I wonder, perhaps you do too. If it were you, would you still stand, even when standing meant dying alone in the dark, unheard and unmarked, just to keep something true alive?